expected at any moment in Minneapolis. Of course, we know that Chauvin is charged with the death of George Floyd, the country watching, the world watching those images. Chauvin with his knee to George Floyd's neck. It prompted an almost immediate reckoning in this country on race, justice, and policing in America. The prosecution focused on those 9 minutes, 29 seconds, and in their closing argument, reminding the jury of the 9-year-old girl, one of the witnesses, the bystanders, who said she heard paramedics 9 minutes later saying, "Get off of him." They said, "Believe what you see." The defense saying it was about more than those 9 minutes, trying to sow doubt in the jury's minds. The jury deliberating for 10.5 hours, 4 hours last night, 6.5 hours today. Chauvin facing charges of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. We heard his voice in that courtroom when he invoked his Fifth Amendment right last week not to take the stand in his own defense. Today, we learned President Biden called George Floyd's family yesterday. The president suggesting today that the evidence is, quote, overwhelming, and saying, quote, "I'm praying that the verdict is the right verdict." And the president adding he was only sharing those words because he knew the jury was sequestered and had begun their work. About 2,000 National Guard members on duty in Minneapolis, police in cities across the country on alert as well. And our entire team is standing by with us this afternoon as we await the verdict in the trial of that former Minneapolis police officer. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, to start our coverage here. And Dan, conventional wisdom, you know, they say it's made to throw it out. But in this case, there were no questions from the jury, no confusion over the charges, no notes sent to the judge, a relatively short amount of time to deliberate.
Yeah, you have to be very nervous if you're Derek Chauvin right now. First of all, because a hung jury is off the table. We now know that this jury is unanimous. And the fact that they didn't ask questions would again suggest that it's more likely, if you were sort of following the way these things go, that it's going to be the highest charge in this case. Why? Because if it was going to be a manslaughter, let's say, for example, you would expect that there might have been more debate about the definitions and discussions about third-degree murder versus manslaughter, etc. For a high-profile case, this is a pretty fast verdict. Some people will tell you, wait a sec, 10 hours plus, that's not so fast. That's true, but in high-profile cases, when the world is watching, the jurors typically want to cross the T's and dot the I's and make it clear to the world that they very carefully considered the evidence. So the fact that they have already come back here with so little coming from the jury has got to be very frightening news for Derek Chauvin right now.
All right, Dan Abrams with us as we await this verdict. Dan, stick with us here. I want to bring Sunny Hostin into this conversation, a former prosecutor herself, ABC News legal analyst, of course, co-host of The View. And Dan makes a good point there, Sunny, about these jurors obviously knowing the weight of this case and that the nation is watching them. And I just want to remind our viewers at home what Judge Cahill said when he was delivering instructions to the jurors. He said, "Do not let bias, prejudice, passion, sympathy, or public opinion influence your decision," and warning them not to consider what consequences their verdict might have. And the fact that they've deliberated for such a short window, what does that signal to you?
Well, conventional wisdom does tell you that fast verdicts hint at agreement. And I will tell you that in all of the cases that I tried, and there were many, especially in the criminal context, what you want as a prosecutor is a fast verdict. Because when there are no questions, when there are no clarifications asked by a jury for jury instructions, when you have nothing to read from the jury, a fast verdict like this indicates that there is a full agreement. I am very surprised, actually, that they reached an agreement in such a high-profile case with 45 witnesses in just a little over 10 hours. That is very unusual in a case like this with 12 jurors. Sometimes in a civil case, yes, you get fast verdicts, but in this kind of case, it is very unusual. I actually was expecting many questions. I was expecting some questions about legal clarification, jury instructions, clarifications, and I was actually, David, also expecting what we call the Allen charge, which is, okay, I understand that you are stuck. I understand that there's disagreement, but I want you to go back and do your best and come to an agreement. I was fully expecting something like that, and obviously that did not happen. The jury has reached an agreement. That's unusual.
Sonny Hostin with us this afternoon. Sonny, underscoring that point that there was not one question from the jury, not one point of contention or query to the judge about confusion over any of the charges, which, as Sonny suggests, points to agreement within the jury, obviously, given the short amount of time that they were deliberating. You're looking at a live picture of Minneapolis. We should mention that those images from inside the courtroom, that was during the course of the trial and the closing arguments. There is no live stream yet up and running from that courtroom. And we should also remind all of you at home that the reason there's a live stream in this case is because we find ourselves not only in this moment, this conversation, this racial reckoning in this country, but also in the middle of a pandemic. The judge deciding to make that rare choice to live stream this trial because he knew that members of the community and members of George Floyd's family would not allow to be in that courtroom given the restrictions on the number of people they're actually allowing inside that court. But in turn, in deciding to live stream the trial, that means the country can watch, the world can watch, and they are waiting for this verdict as well. I want to bring in ABC's Alex Perez, who's been on the ground in Minneapolis since this case began. And Alex, what's the temperature there in Minneapolis? I know it seems relatively calm, although the National Guard on scene, and they are preparing for this verdict as well.
Well, David, they've been preparing for weeks now for this verdict. Yes, there's those 2,000 members of the National Guard sort of scattered all around town. If you look around the downtown area here, most of the businesses are boarded up. People just did not want to take any chances. We remember those protests, those violent protests that happened here last summer, and people are afraid. They want to be ready for any sort of verdict to come. Now, David, we also want to talk about the jury. You know, we've been focusing on every single thing that they've done, and this is a group of jurors that has been taking notes every day during this trial. It was noted that they were attentive, that they were seemed inquisitive and paying attention to the experts who testified. And you know, it's really hard to read the tea leaves in a situation like this, but one of the things that I noted yesterday, just in covering trials, yesterday the jury started deliberating very late, and they stayed an extra hour. Even after a long day, they stayed an extra hour, and this morning they started deliberating about 90 minutes early. And to me, that seemed to indicate that perhaps they were close to reaching something and wanted to work on it. And now we know they have reached some sort of decision, and we're going to learn that decision very soon. And as we await that decision, David, I think about my conversation with Terrence Floyd, George Floyd's brother. And I remember he was in so much pain right after this incident happened. And one of the things he said to me was that seeing this case through, all the way through a conviction, was something that his family wanted for and would continue to fight for until they saw it. So they could have an answer to that very soon, David.
Alex Perez in Minneapolis. Alex, thank you. That was a live picture there of Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, not far from the scene of where this all began to unfold. About a year ago, Memorial Day last year, of course, the corner of Chicago and 38th Street there in front of the Cup Foods in South Minneapolis, George Floyd Square, as it's now called. I want to bring in Lindsey Davis because, Lindsey, you and I have talked so much about this case. We've been on the air together all along the way, and it's so rare that this country takes a sort of deep breath together to watch one of these moments come in. But this is one of those moments, given the reckoning, the conversation in this country. And I think that we were all struck a year ago, and then the continuing protests and conversations over the course of the year, the diversity in the faces of the people out in the streets, small towns, large cities. Somewhat reassuring, I know, to the Floyd family as well, to see the diversity of the people supporting them and this conversation about policing injustice in America.
That's right. So many collectively holding their breath here, David. You can perhaps hear the helicopters above. I know that we just saw the crowds outside of Cup Foods at 38th in Chicago, but just a kind of scene set for you here, just a few blocks away from the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis. It's eerily quiet. You know, there are a few cars, but very few people out on the road. I went for a walk today just to kind of get a temperature and feel of the people. Happened to just come in contact with one man. He happened to be a black man. I said, so what do we think? And he said, I think if they come back quick, we got him. And he had a personal pride. He was invested, some skin in the game. He kind of felt that he was taking this on, certainly personally, with regard to whatever the verdict would be. I was thinking about the jurors as well. I mean, there's people from all walks of life. You have 3 who are in their 20s, ranging in age. You have 1 woman who goes into her 60s, and 6 who identify as people of color, 3 of them black men. You have 1 who's a social worker, accountant, a chemist, a banker, a nurse. And we did get a lot of color during the jury selection about their thoughts on race and social justice and criminal justice. There was a white man who was very clear. He said, look, I believe all lives matter. You had a black man who said that when he had seen the video, he had told his wife that could have been me. And so going into this, they allowed these jurors that had these diverse opinions and backgrounds and experiences and perspectives. And then you had just a few days before before the trial culminated, the fatal shooting of Daunte Wright, which the defense obviously wanted them to be sequestered and not hear that, but the judge allowed them to hear that, and so you have to wonder, were they at all impacted by that, and were they able to just focus on this as an isolated incident, or did they look at the historical injustice of all of this? Additionally, they knew about the $27 million settlement. This was the largest pretrial settlement in America's history for this kind of a civil rights death. And so a lot going into what those jurors brought into this and what they thought as it all played out in real time.
We can hear the choppers overhead there in Minneapolis. Our thanks to Lindsey Davis, and we'll be checking back in with you over the course of this afternoon. These are live pictures on the ground there in South Minneapolis. Relative calm, as you can see, in this community and in so many communities across this country. I think people in their smartphones have heard that there is a verdict, the judge revealing that and saying that the verdict would be delivered in about an hour. That was a little more than an hour ago, so we are expecting that jury at any time. And Lindsey talking about the diversity of the members of that jury. And I know we have that graphic that actually breaks down members of the jury, if we have a moment to bring that back up, just to help folks at home understand that the jury selection was something that both sides so carefully spent time on in this case. Members of the jury, 5 men, 7 women, ages from 20 to 60 years old, 4 black jurors, 6 white jurors, and 2 jurors who self-identify as multiracial. One of the jurors, for example, a white woman in her 50s, she works as a nurse. She assured the court that even though she had seen a portion of that viral video, that the video of George Floyd on the ground, that she could be impartial. And she acknowledged that we all bring life experience to the jury if we are selected, and talked about how her background as a nurse could potentially help her make decisions in this case. I want to bring in Nightline anchor Byron Pitts, who's been covering this right along with us from the very beginning. And Byron, I mentioned this a moment ago in talking with Lindsey, the diversity of the faces of the families across this country who wanted justice after seeing that video themselves. And this has really been almost a year-long conversation in this country about how we move forward.
You're so right, David. And that's why this moment is so different from other moments in American history, where we've seen instances where black America went one direction and white America seemed to go someplace else. In this particular moment, this case, the reaction seemed to be universal. The people of all stripes reacted in a very passionate way to the death of George Floyd. And David, I'm struck by something that you said earlier, that this is a deep breath moment for our nation. I think you're absolutely right. You think about these kinds of trials. I was looking at that trial, the 4 police officers in Los Angeles in 1992, the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995. This day is one of those moments where many Americans will hold their breath to see what happens. And David, I think in many ways we may have 2 verdicts today. We will have the verdict of this jury, this diverse jury, and then the hours and days to come, we will have the verdict of the American people. One can imagine that, however it goes, a portion of America will see that justice will serve. A portion of America will say that justice missed its mark. And I think while we wait for this verdict, it'll also be curious to see, and I think that's why we see the law enforcement presence in Minneapolis and other major cities across this nation, as we all, David, as you said, hold our breath waiting for this verdict.
And of course, Byron, no one wants to get ahead of themselves as far as this verdict is concerned. We do know that the relatively short amount of time and the weight of this case, as we heard from Sonny Hostin earlier, signals that there was agreement and fairly early on within that jury. That jury that was sequestered immediately after those closing arguments, immediately after getting instructions from the judge who asked them not to bring their bias into that decision making, but also not to worry or be concerned with how the country and the world would react to their decision, because after all, the live stream showed the rest of us what transpired in that courtroom, with the exception of the jurors themselves. We all got to watch, but we didn't see the folks who will actually make this decision, who were there from day one during this trial. I want to bring in Terry Austin from Law and Crime, the network that covers this. She's been covering this case, obviously, for the better part of a year. And Terry, I wanted to remind people at home, as we await this decision from the jury, what the prosecution was up against here. They had to convince beyond reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin's actions, his knee to the neck, was a substantial cause of George Floyd's death. Not the only cause, but a substantial one.
That's exactly right. And I think the jury did boil it down to two issues. That issue that you just mentioned, the fact that there was unreasonable use of force, and that the substantial cause of the death was that unreasonable use of force. So they narrowed it down, and I think they came to a quick decision based on all of the evidence. And we had multiple witnesses who talked about this use of force. And of course, we had Chief Arredondo, who was pivotal in stating not only was this unreasonable use of force, but this was against policy and it was not showing the duty of care. The other issue that clearly the jury came to a very swift conclusion was the fact that the cause of death was the knee, and it was unreasonable. And so they listened to all the medical evidence. They listened to all of the evidence from the police officers. They cut to the chase. I'm sure they did consider the different elements that the judge talked about as far as the second degree, third degree, and manslaughter. But I think they narrowed it down to what Jerry Blackwell said on his rebuttal, which was this: use the 46th witness on the stand, which is your common sense. If you believe that, in fact, what you saw on this video was unreasonable force and that the knee on the back and the neck caused the death, then you have to come back with the guilty verdict. And I do believe that's exactly what they did.
Well, we'll wait and see for that, because we also know that the defense spent 3 hours yesterday in its closing argument from defense attorney Eric Nelson to try to sow doubt among that jury, continuing with what he had done over the course of the trial, bringing up past drug use of George Floyd, his heart condition, asking was there the potential of any carbon monoxide from that patrol car? Did bystanders distract Derek Chauvin while he was right there at that scene with his knee to George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, 29 seconds? And the defense attorney trying to make the case that this particular trial is about more than those 9 minutes, that the jurors, when they deliberate, should be thinking about, as he said, the 60 minutes that came before and what Chauvin came upon when he arrived at that scene. He tried to use images of them putting George Floyd into the patrol car, 3 officers trying to do that to no avail, to try to make the case that those were all factors that Derek Chauvin took into account in those 9 minutes. Of course, then the rebuttal from the prosecution, making the point that over the course of those 9 minutes, he certainly had time to react to what he was presiding over during those 9 minutes. And direct reaction to the carbon monoxide suggestion, saying if that were in fact the case, the carbon monoxide was coming from the police patrol car, so he should have been aware of that too. So we saw a back and forth between the prosecution and the defense as they made their closing arguments yesterday. I want to bring in Kenneth Moten from Minneapolis. Kenneth was on the air with us yesterday as we were covering these closing arguments. I know that you have been in touch with George Floyd's family and his family's representation, Ben Crump and others, for their reaction to the prosecution's closing argument, and then the defense once we heard the 3 hours of their closing argument. And I'm curious if you're hearing anything in the last 24 hours and to the development of this last hour.
David, they are gathered in a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. The words we're hearing right now at this hour, they're optimistic they are in good spirits, but they're also anxious, eager, nervous as we await this verdict here. Also, we know that when it comes to this Floyd family, that in the past 10, 11 months or so since the death of George Floyd, this family has gone through a lot. Yes, they got a $27 million settlement, but they lost this loved one, this person they knew, who they watched in this video die at the knee of Derek Chauvin. And so for this family, they've gotten the good and the bad, David. They have gotten a lot of support, but they've also heard from the critics who believe that George Floyd shouldn't have resisted, that he was on drugs, that he was somehow at fault. But they've got a number of supporters, people who have been in these streets. And so Flonis Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, has said that he is urging for peace and calm after this verdict is read, but he knows that he can't control the anger on these streets for those people who are hitting the streets. And really, David, for this family, for months now, they have watched this country go through a racial reckoning. They've watched this country change and many industries change because of this racial reckoning. But they truly feel that today, with this verdict, that today is their day of reckoning. David.
Kenneth Moton in Minneapolis, and the family all along has asked for peace and calm across this country, something Terrence Floyd told me almost a year ago in Brooklyn, that they were deeply moved by the diversity of the faces in these protests across the country, but saying any sort of violence is not what their brother would have wanted. I want to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsami, of course, following the case as well. And Steve, as you and I were on the air yesterday during these closing arguments, we heard the prosecution say this is not an anti-police prosecution, that this is the case of Derek Chauvin, one lone officer in this particular trial. We know other officers will come later, perhaps later this summer, but this case is about Derek Chauvin, they said. And what was fascinating in this trial, and somewhat rare, as you know, Steve, is that sort of blue wall came down. There were a number of police witnesses that they used to make this case, and they put up a graphic during their closing argument, the prosecution just showing just the significance of the number of police witnesses who came forward and said this action was not justified.
That's right, David. And chief among them was this officer's former boss. You had a prosecutor saying that this wasn't policing, this was murder, that this was a shocking abuse of authority, that you cannot justify what everyone saw in that videotape. And I want to share just a little bit of inside baseball. You know, Byron alluded to the Rodney King incident. You know, there are a lot of people saying that the only difference between what happened in the Rodney King incident, where those officers walked away, and what is happening here is the improved quality of the videotape. You know, this verdict could prove that line wrong, or it could underline it. So a lot of people, especially in Black America, are waiting to see, will this happen again? Will what we see with our own eyes be rejected by a jury? And I'll tell you, some of the arguments that we were hearing from the defense in this case, that this was I call it the super black of defense, you know, a big black man who was super strong and had some chemicals that were assisting him in his strength. You know, we've heard many of those arguments before in some of these other cases. The Walter Scott case in South Carolina, people forget that was another case where you saw a police officer shoot a black man in the back. It was on camera, and that officer was not acquitted in state court. And in fact, when we polled the jury, you know, we expected there was probably one holdout, and that's what the defense in this case is hoping for, just one. But in that case, there were two, and one of the holdouts was African American. So you just never know what you're going to get from these cases, what the jury is hearing, how they process the information. And you know, one thing I want to underline that the prosecution, as you pointed out, was very big about was they wanted to make sure that this wasn't an anti-police case. They wanted to underline to any jurors out there that this isn't about punishing cops. This is about punishing a bad cop. And that was the message that they were really trying to underline, and that we'll see if it has gotten across to the jurors in this case. David.
It's so important to point out, Steve, that we simply do not know what this jury has decided. All we do know is that they have come to a verdict in a relatively short amount of time. As Steve mentioned there, the defense, what they try to do is, of course, sow some doubt in the mind of at least one juror, to hold up the verdict, to get them to deliberate even longer, to get one of the jurors to make other jurors question in that deliberation room. But that does not appear to be the case. case. Obviously, in this trial, to reach a verdict of guilty or not guilty, all 12 jurors need to agree on a charge, and that is what we have here. We simply don't know what their decision is in this case. And I want to bring in Terry Moran, because Terry, we were talking there with Byron and with Steve and Lindsey a little earlier about the diversity of faces, the wide swath of Americans. It sort of was the fabric of America that we watched over the course of the last year. People who looked at that video and then had to have that conversation with their children at home. Children, and we saw the 9-year-old witness in this case who said she heard paramedics say, "Get off of him." Children often know, when they look at an image at least, what they believe is right or wrong.
They do, David, and Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell used the testimony of that 9-year-old girl, a minor witness not identified by name in this trial, to make the case to the jury. She got it right. And it's the feeling that we all had when my own then 7-year-old daughter asked my wife what had happened. She'd heard something about it, and my wife had explained it to her. She burst into tears. And that's the wisdom of a 7-year-old, too. And I think one of the things, having covered trials where police officers are on trial in the past, our country has, as we know, a bad history in many ways with these. Something felt different to me in this one. The first eyewitnesses, the bystander eyewitnesses, that 9-year-old girl, her cousin Darnella Frazier, who took the videotape, Charles McMillan, who was the elder, the mayor of that community, who took the witness stand and burst into tears. The whole world saw that video. They saw the event. And they brought us even closer to that experience of horror that we all had in watching that. The other thing that felt different, the thin blue line shattered in this case. The chief of police, Medaria Arredondo of Minneapolis, took the stand against his former officer. So did other officers in that department. Took the witness stand and testified for the prosecution against Derek Chauvin, a police officer, an expert witness from the Los Angeles Police Department, came across the country. Lawyers I talked to said they'd never seen anything like it. So there was something different in this trial. The reckoning of the uprising that happened in our streets, I think, was felt in that courtroom, and not in an illegitimate way, in a true way.
Terry, stick with us here as we look at live pictures from Minneapolis, the people of that community, and really across this country now. So many have had the chance to be alerted through social media or on their phone that the verdict has been reached. One of those very rare moments in this country, as I mentioned earlier, when people will come to the TV or wherever they can get their information to find out what the decision will be from these jurors. But Terry, you bring up a good point. There was something about this trial, a number of things that were different from what we've seen in the past. But one of the things that was I took note of was the fact that both sides tried to make bias an issue. We heard from the prosecution about the bias that we're all raised to believe that police officers, and the vast majority of them do, try to protect and serve their community, but that we should not think about police as a whole, but about this specific officer. That was what the prosecution said to the jurors as they were prepared to go in and then deliberate his fate. On the flip side of that, we heard the closing argument yesterday that the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin saying, don't be biased with everything that they have presented in this case. You must keep in mind what Derek Chauvin saw and heard when the dispatch call first came in, what he saw when he arrived on the scene in those 16 minutes before. Those crucial 9 minutes that the country and the world saw. But he tried to make the case you must think about the information that he gathered in his head in the 16 minutes prior. And he tried to introduce the bystanders, the witnesses, as a form of distraction. And at some points, he tried to make the case that there was a potential danger from people there in the community. Those two very different arguments over bias. And I'm curious if it struck you and which argument carried greater weight.
It did, and I think you're exactly right on what the defense was trying to do there by in South Chicago, 38th in Minneapolis, 38th in Chicago and Minneapolis, a very diverse neighborhood, trying to communicate to the jurors, well, Derek Chauvin had a legitimate concern because, there were people from that neighborhood on the street. But the problem was we heard from them, the jurors heard from them, and they saw the picture of them, and they heard what they were trying to do. They were trying to stop what they thought was an atrocity. And I think one of the things that the defense had such a hard problem with is that I think every decent American, every patriotic American recognizes that we have had a problem in this country. We've had a problem with the use of force against black bodies and black people. And that's not to say that a person like Derek Chauvin can't get a fair trial. It is to understand that the history here, has resulted in bad verdicts. And the jury has that history in their hearts, as we all do. And that, I think, is how they're going to address those claims of bias on both sides. Their job is to look at the evidence against this man and the law in this case. But they speak for the community, for their local community, and for all of us.
Terry Moran with us from our Washington Bureau. Terry, thank you. As we continue to look at pictures, these are the aerial pictures, of course, from Minneapolis coming in. There's also pictures from South Minneapolis, right in front of the Cup Foods, the scene of horror, really, witnessed by the entire world because of the video that was captured that day. And you can see the vigil there for George Floyd, the images of George Floyd and people gathering. Very calm scenes across this country, as we have mentioned here. No one wants to get ahead of themselves. We have no idea what the jury has decided. All we know at this point, for those of you just joining us for our live coverage, 5 p.m. Eastern, is that the judge in this case, Judge Cahill in Minneapolis, has revealed that the jurors have reached a verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis Police Officer Derek Chauvin, who has been charged with 3 charges, as we know, in the death of George Floyd. We will learn from the jury momentarily. He said in about an hour. That would have been about 30 minutes ago, but we do know that they were sequestered in a hotel in Minneapolis. You have to factor in the idea that they would be brought and there's high security in this case to the Hennepin County courtroom, several floors up in that office building in downtown Minneapolis, where we have seen the fencing and the significant presence of the National Guard, though luckily, and we have not seen any reason for that security up until this point. And of course, everyone waiting to hear what the jury has decided in this case. I want to bring in Deborah Roberts. ABC's Deborah Roberts, a mom, first and foremost, and a veteran correspondent here. But Deborah, you were telling us that it's a conversation that you had in your family with your children just in the last 24 hours about how the country, how the world might react to this.
That's right, David. And I'd have to tell you, when you all alluded to the videotape, as Steve Osunsami talked about, that was so much clearer and so much more impactful this time. Yesterday, watching those closing arguments and seeing so much of that excruciating videotape just sort of, I think, took us all back to last summer when this case just struck everybody. And if you have blood running through your veins, there's just no way you weren't impacted by that videotape. And just hearing those cries of George Floyd calling for his mother. I mean, there was something that was so primal and so difficult about that. And I did interviews last year with moms talking about how that affected them. And of course, of so many of us having conversations, as Terry said, with our children. And I had a conversation with my own 18-year-old son about it. And I have to tell you, it was emotional for me hearing him talk about how fearful he was after seeing something like that. And even right now, he can't even look at it. He turns away from this tape, seeing this man's final minutes on this earth. So I think there's something about that tape that just struck at everyone. And I think while we all know that, you can't predict a jury and there are going to be people, as Terry said, who may feel like the jury got it wrong, there just seems to be sort of this united feeling in this country that there was something so terribly wrong that went on last year. And I think that people are just waiting. I mean, someone just posted on social media, I'm sick to my stomach waiting for this verdict. I think for so many people, this is the culmination of just an awful event that we have had to witness as people, with our children, as parents. And it has been something that has been very, very difficult. And I think that the weight of this verdict is sort of in play right here for so many of us who are dealing with this as parents, as well as just people who are watching what's going to happen. So you can't, I think, overstate the anxiety and the nervousness that people are feeling as they're waiting to see this come to a conclusion.
And Deborah, we of course have to remember that there is another family watching all of this all over again, and that's the family of George Floyd. And Deborah, I'm curious, a year later, with the context of all of the reporting now, that 9-minute video spoke volumes just by what we saw in the video, but given the context of the reporting and then what we've watched, because there was a live stream of the trial. So the country, the world watching, both sides make their cases, and with that additional context and with the very emotional testimony of those bystanders. I mean, we met just about everybody standing on that sidewalk just by watching this trial, and you have to wonder, and we'll learn which way the jury decides here in just a short time from now, but you have to wonder the impact of playing that video in the courtroom, not just for the family of George Floyd. It must have been excruciating to go through this all over again, but in those closing arguments, the decision by the prosecution, they went much shorter with the video than they did in the opening statement. On the flip side, the defense used quite a bit of the video with George Floyd on the ground, and I'll be curious to see what jurors decide from watching that video. In many ways, it was more difficult the second time around. And Judge Cahill now in the courtroom. Deborah, stand by. Our entire team standing by.
All rise for the jury. All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes. Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately, returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All right.
Thank you.
So there you have it. The jury in Hennepin County in Minneapolis finding Derek Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Guilty in all 3. You can see him being led away there in the courtroom. He had been out on bail. You heard the state request of the judge that bail be revoked and that he be taken into custody, which is exactly what the judge decided to do. You can see the counts up on your screen right now. The jury deliberating yesterday afternoon and then began deliberating again early this morning, but it was a short period of time before we learned that they had come to a unanimous conclusion. Clearly, they thought that the case made by the prosecution and perhaps that final closing argument, that rebuttal from Jerry Blackwell when he said to the jury, it's as simple as what that 9-year-old girl, one of the bystanders, said that she heard the paramedics say when they arrived there more than 9 minutes after that knee was put to George Floyd's neck. She said that she heard paramedics say, get off of him. Of course, in the hours and the days to come, we will learn more from that jury, what they were thinking over the course of this 3-week trial. But we want to look at the reaction coming in from Minneapolis. This was the scene in South Minneapolis just moments ago. They had described the sound of the people gathering there, obviously erupting. Embracing one another, and in many ways for that community and for the people who have gathered there, it has been an extraordinarily long year in this country. This was the scene again, George Floyd Square. This is reaction from the family, George Floyd's family, with their legal team, Ben Crump, we know, leading that team, clearly overjoyed. They believe justice has been served in this case. Derek Chauvin found guilty on all counts. And I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, as we look at these images. Clearly, the pause there is in between each count as the judge was reading from that piece of paper delivered to him by the foreperson of the jury. And Dan, guilty on all counts. They believe the prosecution made its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yep, on each and every charge. And remember that there are slightly different theories with regard to second-degree murder and third-degree murder. I mean, there was a possibility that he could be found guilty of second-degree murder, not of third-degree murder, and then guilty of second-degree manslaughter. That didn't happen. This was a prosecution clean sweep here. And now Derek Chauvin will be sentenced on the highest charge, which is second-degree murder, faces up to 40 years. The sentencing guidelines in Michigan suggest more likely 10 to 15 years. But I'll tell you, David, you mentioned that 9-year-old girl, and she could be relevant in the context of sentencing because prosecutors can ask for what's called an enhancement in the sentencing, meaning to go beyond what the guidelines would suggest because a child was present. And so that 9-year-old girl was not just an emotional witness, but she could become a very important witness with regard to the potential sentence that Derek Chauvin gets. You heard him, the judge, then referring to the Blakely standard, and that means basically start preparing for the argument over sentencing. And that will be the next phase of this case to determine what the sentence for Derek Chauvin will be. But at this point, Certainly a big win for the prosecution in this case, getting everything that they asked this jury for.
Just to drill down on that point, Dan, as per Minnesota state law, the jury will decide, the judge will decide sentencing on the highest of the charges, which of course is unintentional second-degree murder. The presumed sentence is usually 10 to 15 years, but he faces up to 40 years. And as you mentioned, the state will ask for what's called an aggravated sentence here, and he could face decades behind bars.
Absolutely. And, I think that is going to be, really the next big debate in this case over exactly what should be the sentence for Derek Chauvin. Again, as we talked about when the jury reached its verdict and we said they came back so quickly, this is not good news for Derek Chauvin. Again, on the sentencing side, I wouldn't want to be Derek Chauvin either, meaning that, typically, and it's not just typically, it's really the vast majority of cases where you're talking about second-degree murder or third-degree murder. You are talking about up to 15 years. But in this case, based on a number of factors, I expect the prosecution to ask for more time, and the judge will have to determine that. And David, I want to just add one other quick point, which is about the diversity of this jury. And I think it's important because we often talk about diversity and it sounds like a concept, as opposed to something that can actually instill a sense of confidence in people about a verdict. The fact that there were 4 people who were African American on that jury. There were 2 who described themselves as multiracial, 6 whites, and they all came together and very quickly agreed on this verdict. This was a jury of peers, and as a result, I think that that's helpful in instilling confidence in the verdict for the community at large.
And Sonny Hostin, as we look at these images coming in from across the country, but first, of course, from Minneapolis, relief in that community. And you yourself said, as a former prosecutor yourself, when you heard that there was a verdict and this quickly, that even you had thought there would be at least questions from perhaps the jurors for the judge, and there was not. Unanimous, guilty on all charges.
Yeah. David, I've been a lawyer for 27 years, and I remember when I was in law school during my first year, the Rodney King verdict came out, and it was an acquittal for 4 officers who, on video, beat and stomped and tased a man, beat a man 56 times with a baton. And I believed my eyes then. So I believed my eyes this time with George Floyd. And even though I knew that fast verdicts always hint at an agreement, even though all of my training told me that they likely convicted on at least the highest count or at least the lowest count, because of the history in this country, because it is so rare that police officers are convicted, because black men and black boys are killed by police with impunity in this country, and that is just the truth, at a rate 5 times more than their white counterparts. Because I am the mother of an 18-year-old boy who is now in South Africa, and I feel that he is safer in South Africa than he is in his own country. I am so relieved that this is what justice finally looks like for my community. And while I know that this does not bring George Floyd back to his family, to his loved ones, to his brother who we've heard from so eloquently, at least I believe now that the movement that we've seen since his murder on video for the world to see is not just a moment. I really believe that this is a movement that we've seen. And for that, I am so very thankful that perhaps we will see real change, much needed change in this country.
Sunny Hostin with some very personal reflections on our coverage this afternoon and the guilty verdict from the jury in Minneapolis. Sunny, thank you. And when you couple what Sunny said and her observations along with what Dan Abrams said just moments before her, that perhaps this could be a unifying moment when you think about the jury and the diversity, the makeup of that jury. 6 white jurors, 6 people of color, 4 black jurors, and 2 who self-identify as multiracial, that they all deliberated together and in just a short period of time were united on what they saw when they watched those 9 minutes and what they heard over the course of 3 weeks inside that Minneapolis courtroom. You can see they have begun to put up signs in Minneapolis. That's the scene from South Minneapolis. Justice served is what that sign says underneath George Floyd's name now. They've now put that up on the sign. And my colleague, Lindsey Davis, is in Minneapolis. And Lindsey, the reaction there.
David, you know, there was a novel by Terry McMillan, subsequently a movie called Waiting to Exhale. Today it was so much more than that. That was All of Us. And just a little while ago, I was telling you about how the streets here were empty. You virtually saw, you hardly saw any people or cars. Well, suddenly now you hear just this celebratory honking. I saw a small group of black people walk by who chanted Black Lives Matter. And certainly, you know, this verdict doesn't change our criminal justice system, but perhaps for some, at least for this day, if nothing more beyond that, it does send this message. And for those who consider this to be a win or a victory, perhaps they owe a debt to Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who shot that video, because so much was made of the prosecution's saying, but for the knee, right? And I imagine many today are saying, but for the videotape, would we find ourselves in this place today? After all, if we go back to how this started, all with a counterfeit $20 bill, a crime that Chief Arredondo testified that normally they wouldn't even take somebody into custody for. So much jubilation really on the streets here.
Lindsey Davis on the ground in Minneapolis for us as we continue our live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He was a veteran with the police force there in Minneapolis, a 19-year veteran, 45 years old. He's been found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. We're getting some color from inside that courtroom, and of course the live stream offers the country and the world a perspective that we would not have seen had we not been in this pandemic. The judge saying he was doing this live stream because the community would not be allowed to come into the courtroom and witness this trial as it unfolded. But some of what we can't see in that courtroom has just come in, and this is from the print reporter who was inside the courtroom. They're allowing a reporter or two inside that courtroom every day, but because of restrictions, just a small number of reporters. They described the scene as the judge said, all rise. The jurors entering that courtroom, we are told all of them looked serious. None of them looked emotional, or that they had been teary, or that there had been, emotions exchanged while they were deliberating. All of them, in this note that we've been given by the print reporter who was in the room, serious as they walked into the courtroom. Judge Cahill reading the verdicts on that paper as Chauvin stared at the empty witness podium. And as you saw at home, as we were carrying this live, this is the era that we're in, the face mask. There was very little reaction unless you're reading the eyes of Derek Chauvin. And I do believe we have video of the actual moment. You won't be able to see much, but here's what we saw.
Permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, defendant. Verdict, count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19.
And that's the reaction from
caption,
Derek
verdict,
Chauvin
count
as he went
two.
through each of the
Either
counts.
above entitled matter as to count
As you
two.
can see.
Third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count three. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count three, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now
There you
going to
have
ask
it,
you
Derek
individually
Chauvin,
if these are
his reaction
correct
inside
verdicts.
that courtroom, of course wearing a
Please
mask,
respond
which
yes
makes
or
it
no.
very difficult
Juror number two, are
for
these
anyone
your
to
children?
truly judge at home what the reaction was, though it seemed rather stoic, calm, and as he was led away from the courtroom, no resistance, and that was in the note that he stood up. That certainly his defense attorney prepared him for the very likely scenario that if he was found guilty, that the state would ask the judge to revoke bail, which is exactly what they did. And of course, given his background in law enforcement, he knew that was very likely what would happen if found guilty on really any of the charges. Those are the descriptions from inside the courtroom, and of course we'll learn more in the hours and the days to come. One of the things that we were struck by today is that even before this verdict was delivered by this jury in Minneapolis, we heard from President Biden at the White House weighing in on this case, and he said he was only weighing in, offering what he did, because he knew that the jurors in this case had been sequestered and would not hear what the president was saying. The White House revealing today that he did call the family of George Floyd in the last 24 hours. And I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because Cecilia, you were telling me just before we came on this afternoon that we were actually expecting to hear from President Biden, but that was put on hold, and we obviously assumed it was because the White House knew this was coming, not what verdict was coming, but that there was a significant development and that we would soon learn it.
And David, I know from speaking with sources over the last few weeks in the lead up to this moment that we are in as a country, that they've been trying to figure out the right way to have the president speak out and address the nation. I expect that we will hear from him at some point soon. We do know from colleagues that here in the White House who are inside the White House right now that we've seen people. Are we going to hear from him? Is that what you're telling me? Okay, not yet. But we have seen preparations, staffers at a podium, so we do expect to hear from him. I would not be surprised. We know, David, that the president has been watching this trial very closely, and that he has developed a relationship with the family of George Floyd. You mentioned that he spoke to his brother today, and the press secretary told us earlier this afternoon that this is, of course, a president who knows intimately what it means to live with grief, and he has that connection with the family of George Floyd, and that the president himself has said that he developed a connection with them. But he did make these controversial comments earlier this morning when the president said that he believed that the evidence against Chauvin was overwhelming and that he was praying for the right verdict. The White House would not clarify when they were pushed on what that right verdict meant. But David, we know what President Biden has said all along, that he believes that George Floyd was murdered, but that he believed he suffered at the hands of brutality in his death. So we also know, though, that we heard that warning from the judge in the courtroom, Judge Cahill, just yesterday, that he warned politicians against making statements on this case for fear that it would taint the jury, even though they are sequestered. The president and the White House have said that he would not have made this statement like this if they were not, in fact, that jury was not sequestered. So they tried to sort of back away from that. But we have heard from defense attorneys in many cases that they believe that it isn't appropriate for politicians to comment and weigh in ahead of jury verdicts for fear that they could end up being part of an appeal. It is extremely unusual to hear from a president in a case like this one. Nonetheless, we are here, David. We are waiting from word from the White House when and if we will hear from the president address the nation. I expect that to happen.
And one more point I wanted to ask you about, Cecilia. One more thing that the president said, and I know that you monitored this as well, is that he said that he knew that the jury was under significant weight in this case, that they were aware of what they were going to be deliberating over. He said, I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, but he also said, I can only imagine the pressure and anxiety they're feeling, and so I waited until the jury was sequestered sequestered before I called George Floyd's family. And we heard, Cecilia, from the judge in this case, too, as he thanked them for their service. And this is going to be an extraordinary part of the story that unfolds over the course of the next few days, the weight that these jurors felt, but the judge thanking them for the heavy-duty jury service from those jurors.
Exactly. And President Biden touching on that. You know, David, this is a moment in our country that we are living in as a country collectively that is not lost on this White House, that is not lost on this president, not just what the jury, not just what everybody in that courtroom went through, not just what the people of Minneapolis and that community and the family are going through, but what this country is going through. And just think back to the campaign. This is a man who campaigned on racial reckoning, who said he got into this race because of what happened in Charlottesville under President Trump. He was propelled in part, large part, into office by the help of African-American voters in this country. That is how he won the nomination. So he feels the weight of this moment and this cultural reckoning that we are in. But David, there is also a political side to this as well. He promised police reform. He promised action on police reform on day one, and that has yet to happen. Instead, he is not backing a police commission that he said he would, a study commission. He is instead hoping on action on Capitol Hill that is stalled right now, David.
Cecilia Vega, monitoring developments from the White House. If and when we hear from President Biden, we will go right back to Cecilia. I should mention that many of our stations in the East might be joining their local news broadcasts, but we will continue until 6 p.m. Eastern. So should we hear from the president, we will bring that to you live. We will also bring you the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, should he speak before we go off the air at 6 for local news here in the East, and then I'll be back on at 6:30 with our entire team. I wanted to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsama. You heard Cecilia talk about the campaign, and we cannot forget that this all played out not only during the pandemic, but in the middle of a presidential campaign, and one of the most, if not the most, highly charged campaigns of modern American history. And as Cecilia pointed out, this was something that President Biden did not shy away from. He talked about this reckoning in America, this conversation in America, and he said it was a conversation that was long overdue, Steve.
It's frankly one of the reasons why Joe Biden was able to get so many votes here in Georgia, because of that issue. That racial reckoning that happened after this incident not only affected our political world, it affected our workplaces, it affected our interpersonal relationships. And, I want to underline something here. You're seeing a lot of pictures of people celebrating, fist pumping, jumping in the air. But I want to underline that the thing that they're celebrating isn't the defeat of a police officer. It's the acknowledgement that in this incident, a black life that many Americans felt wasn't going to get its proper respect and due was recognized, and the jurors saw that and sided with what should have been, sided with what was justice. Actually determined that what you saw, that the sky was blue, yes, indeed, the sky was blue. That's what I think people are celebrating in the street, and what you're going to hear people celebrating. And, as much as the jury, we all expected, of course, the jury to come back and have its say. We knew that America was going to have its say as well. The streets were going to react to this, and the streets are reacting right now with a sense of relief, with a sense of justice, with a sense of equality achieved, because so many of these cases, David, you and I have reported on many of these incidents where there was video, where it seemed as clear as day, and because of people's feelings about police officers, the officer was not acquitted, or it was a hung jury. That didn't happen in this case. You're hearing people chant Black Lives Matter, because that's really what this was all about. That was the heart of it. David?
Steve Osunsama, who covered the presidential campaign and who covered it from a local level right there in Georgia, and the wide impact that state had, the voters in that state, their voices, shifting power in Washington on a number of levels. I want to bring in Ken Moten, who's reporting from Minneapolis for us. And Ken, you learned of late developments involving George Floyd's family.
The moment Philonise Floyd, George Floyd's younger brother, walked out of that courtroom, we understand he got a call from President Biden. In fact, we just watched a live stream, a social media live stream, David, from one of the family attorneys, where President Biden was essentially congratulating George Floyd's family, also family attorney Ben Crump, and he even referenced what George Floyd's daughter said last summer, that her daddy changed the world, is going to change the world. And so that was a personal conversation the two had. It was on a social media live stream, but we understand, yes, President Biden has reached out to the family. Philonise Floyd actually spoke to the president before the verdict as well. We know that when it comes to President Biden, he has suffered tremendous loss himself. And so he spoke from that viewpoint, from that aspect. And it was words of comfort to the family as well. But when it comes to inside that courtroom, David, we're hearing also that Philonise Floyd was inside. He was the family member who was inside. There's been at least one family member inside that courtroom every single day over the course of this trial. And as Philonise Floyd heard that verdict, guilty, 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 he had his hands clasped over his head, and he became shakier and shakier as he heard each count there, guilty. Also, family members are gathered inside a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. Tears of joy, David, is what we understand, chanting George Floyd's name, just like the demonstrators on these streets, chanting that name over and over again, also saying it's an unbelievable feeling in that room. You mentioned Terrence Floyd, David, that you interviewed last summer. He said he was nervous, angry, but there is this relief that he feels right now. And when it comes to Chauvin being taken away in handcuffs, the family was chanting, yes, that's right, take him away. This is the moment they've been waiting for so long. They've gotten a big settlement. They've gotten a lot of support from the family, but this is what they were waiting for. And now as we await to hear from the family within the next few minutes or so, David, we understand they're going on to the next chapter of making sure they take this to the next level when it comes to legislation and police reform. David.
Next steps from the family, pushing for new legislation, and as Kenneth Moton just reported, police reform. But perhaps the biggest headline out of Ken Moton's reporting there in Minneapolis is that President Biden called George Floyd's family in the moments after this verdict was delivered in that courtroom, guilty on all counts. And we remember when we were broadcasting World News Tonight from Houston on the eve of the funeral for George Floyd, that it was then former Vice President Joe Biden, the presidential candidate at the time, who traveled to Houston to meet with Floyd's family. He met George Floyd's youngest daughter, met with the family on the day before the funeral, and we remember that during the funeral, there was a videotaped message then delivered from Joe Biden. This has been a long conversation over the course of the better part of a year between Joe Biden, who is now the president, and the family of George Floyd. He has not shied away from his support for this family, offering words on this trial, as Cecilia reported a short time ago, only after the president said that he knew the jurors were sequestered and beginning their difficult work of deliberating, but that he hoped that there would be the right verdict. The White House was pressed today by reporters what the president meant by that. They would not elaborate. Though, as Cecilia pointed out, the president clearly not fearful of how Americans would read that, his choice of words in the hours earlier today before we heard the verdict. I want to bring back in Deborah Roberts, if she's still with us, just because of something that struck me earlier when you were talking about having talked to your son again about this last night, Deb. You know, the video has been out there all year long, but it doesn't get any easier to watch over the course of this trial, and that your son often still looks away to this day because parents across this country are going to be reacting to the news of this verdict and having conversations with their families all over again tonight.
I think you're right, David, and I think that's what makes it so difficult, and that's why my friend and colleague Sunny Hostin, I think, just sort of lost her composure, and I so get that, because I think what was so clear here for so many people, whether you're a mother of color or just a person in general watching this, is that, you know, George Floyd was a man whose life should have had value. And yes, he was an imperfect man. He was struggling with the drug addiction and he had other problems in his life. But I think so many of us, and probably Sonny included, looked at that videotape, you know, with a gun in his face and the way he was treated so quickly over, you know, a fraudulent $20 bill. I think so many of us looked at that and we saw our own sons, our own brothers, our own husbands and family members. And you sort of thought that, you know, it sort of represented, I think, sort of this lack of value of a life of somebody of color. And as Steve Osunsami pointed out, David, you and I and all of us have reported on other situations where maybe a white man had an encounter with police. I certainly reported on one where he pulled a gun on the police, and he was not shot. He was taken into custody peacefully because they wanted to take him into custody peacefully, and they went out of their way not to shoot him. And I think for those of us in the media, we've had opportunities to see cases like that, and maybe people at home don't necessarily think about it and process it that way. But I think for so many of us looking at that videotape over and over again of George Floyd, just so quickly the situation escalating, and, you know, he's screaming and plaintively asking for, you know, mercy simply to be taken into custody in a way that was I think that was fair. And I think so many of us felt that, and I think that's the core of the emotion here, that it didn't have to be that way and it didn't have to escalate that way. It wasn't about whether George Floyd was a perfect man. It was really about the fact that he was a man and he should have been treated as such. And I think for a lot of people, this resonates as sort of a victory in the sense that we need to start regarding people, you know, as people and treating them with humanity and respect. And, you know, for once people saw justice and saw somebody being held into account because of how that was handled. And I think that at the core is what a lot of people will be feeling and talking about tonight. And maybe actually, as Lindsey said, exhaling a little bit tonight, thinking that maybe the system can recognize bad behavior sometimes on the place of law enforcement. So I think that is, David, something that will be resonating and being talked about a lot tonight.
Deborah Roberts with us for our coverage this afternoon. And as Deb points out, the conversation begins in homes across the country, probably right now as we're on the air, now that we've learned the verdict here this afternoon. And as we heard Ken Moten report just moments ago, President Biden reaching out to the family of George Floyd after the verdict was read. We have not heard publicly from the president yet, but we have learned that he has talked with George Floyd's family. I want to bring in our senior congressional correspondent, Rachel Scott, who I believe is at Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. Of course, that was created in the aftermath of what happened to George Floyd and the effort to push for reform and for justice. And Rachel, you heard what Ken Moten said there a moment ago, that this doesn't necessarily end this chapter, that the Floyd family believes that this is the beginning of a conversation, and that the next part of this conversation is, how do we make change in this country?
That's exactly right, David. I mean, when I'm standing here in Black Lives Matter Plaza, a plaza that now has the words Black Lives Matter printed in bold yellow letters on this block leading up to the White House. But activists, black people in this country, want more than just a symbol. They want change, and they want that to come through legislation. We heard Cecilia Vega talk about police reform in this country being stalled. We saw those conversations about police reform from bipartisan group of lawmakers. Those went nowhere after the death of George Floyd. We're seeing those talks sort of resume again, but they want more from this White House. They want more from lawmakers in Congress. Just moments after this verdict was read, I watched one young black man just fall to his knees in tears here, overcome with emotion. I just talked to him. He told me he was out here over the summer as those protests over racial reckoning erupted in this country. He says that he saw himself in George Floyd. And today, David, I'm also thinking about moments that we were on the air during George Floyd's funeral. I remember being out here, and I remember a group of protesters were here, and they started with the name of George Floyd, but then they went down the names of other black lives that have been taken at the hands of police. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, so many others. And that really struck to the heart of what this movement is about. It is about change. Every person that comes out here, people that are gathering here right now, they have stories. They have stories in which they have experienced racial inequality in this country. I remember being out here night after night during the summer, talking to families who brought their children here to have those tough conversations about race in this country, about what it means to be white in America, about what it means to be black in America. But David, every single person that I spoke with said that they wanted change, and that change comes through legislation. Many here today feel like we took one step forward towards that change, David.
Rachel Scott reporting from Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington. a relatively peaceful scene, though she described in great detail witnessing one young black man who fell to his knees in reaction to the verdict here this afternoon. I know that Good Morning America's Michael Strahan has been watching this unfold this afternoon right here along with us. Michael, what do you make of what you've learned here this afternoon, and what's your reaction?
Well, David, I appreciate you having me on, and I think my reaction is looking at the verdict, and you feel as it is justified. You feel maybe this is the changing of the tide. Hopefully, you no longer get away with killing a black person, no matter who you are in society, not just as a police officer, but for anyone. And you look at this case, and it definitely, black people in America have been, treated in a different way when it comes to dealing with the police. But this is also about just humanity as a whole. To see this as a human being, it was disturbing. And at the end of it all, I think that you see people celebrating and you see people are happy, but it does not bring George Floyd back. It does not, bring any anything. You had Breonna Taylor, you had Philando Castile, you had all these others who did not get the justice that we see here in the case of George Floyd, but he still has a family who still have to suffer through the fact that, yes, their verdict is guilty, but yet he will never walk through their door again. But I think, as a whole, as a black man in this country, and being, as black people in this country, we feel that hopefully this is a changing of the guard, like a change that will show that people of color will be treated with the respect and the dignity of everyone else, and it won't be an afterthought. We won't be surprised when something like this happens and the verdict is guilty. We won't be on the edge of our seat hoping that the verdict is guilty when it's very hard to understand how it couldn't be. So I just think that this is a feeling of hope. But yet, I want everybody to keep in mind that there's still a family that is grieving the loss of a brother, a father, and a son. And those things will never go away from that family, regardless of what this verdict does. But it is so good to see that the justice system has made the right decision in this case, and that hopefully this is something that rings and makes change for the future of the minorities in this country.
Michael Strahan reporting in this afternoon, and Michael making an extraordinarily profound point there, that it is important that we all remember that there is a family at the heart of this case and at the heart of this trial, George Floyd's family. And even though we saw their reaction, that they do believe justice has been served, that it certainly doesn't bring back their father, their brother, their son. Michael Strahan, our thanks to you. We do know that we heard just moments ago from Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison. Here's what he had to say.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Ellison. I'm the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. And since the investigation and prosecution of this case began last May, everyone involved has pursued one goal: justice. We pursued justice wherever it led. When I became the lead prosecutor for the case, I asked for time and patience to review the facts, gather evidence, and prosecute for the murder of George Floyd to the fullest extent the law allowed. I want to thank the community for giving us that time and allowing us to do our work.
The Minnesota Attorney General there, Keith Ellison, talking to the community there, thanking the jury for doing their work, and the community, certainly they had been bracing, not only there in Minnesota and in Minneapolis, for any possible outcome and any potential reaction to that outcome. And so far, obviously, what you're seeing from right there in South Minneapolis, that is the corner where this played out a year ago, Memorial Day, George Floyd Square in front of Cup Foods. The shrine to George Floyd, and you saw the hugs and some tears right after the verdict was read from that community. And as we heard from Lindsey Davis earlier, as we were on the air, the immediate change in temperature in Minneapolis, on the streets of Minneapolis, that people exhaled, if you will. That was the word that Lindsey used to describe the moment. I want to bring in Cecilia Vega because, Cecilia, we did learn from Ken Moten that President Biden did reach out to George Floyd's family, and we are aware that this has been a relationship that the president has forged with this family not just now, not just during this trial, but all the way back to when the country and the world witnessed this video. He went to meet with them in Houston on the eve of that funeral, and he's kept in contact with this family ever since.
He has, David. They spoke this morning. They just spoke again. We found out from Kenneth Moden. And I do have a little bit of breaking news from the White House just in to tell you about. We don't have many details, but I am told by the White House that the president and the vice president will deliver remarks later this evening, they say, on the verdict. So clearly that is going to happen at some point later this evening. But, you know, this is something that we have heard from this White House and frankly, from this president himself. This is not something that he shies away from. The personal grief and the personal tragedy that he has lived in his own life, having lost children, having lost a wife so tragically young, just as he was being sworn in as a senator here in Washington all those years ago. And this is a president who very much governs as an empathetic ear. As someone who connects one-on-one with people and who does not shy away from having those difficult conversations. And in his own memoirs, he has talked about that is how he relates and that is how he thinks when he is inside a building like this one or when he governed all those years in the Senate as someone who is empathetic, who can really understand the grief and the sadness that people go through. And he talks often to families who are living through such awful tragedies like the one that the George Floyd family has gone through, that one day there will come a time, he hopes for them, that there will be a smile on their face when they remember those loved ones, that smile and those happy memories will overshadow the sad ones. And that is, I'm sure, part of the conversation that he has had with this family. We talked earlier about the controversy, the president weighing in on this verdict before the verdict actually happened, saying that he was praying for the right verdict. I think we know where the president's mind and heart was on what the outcome that he wanted to see, even though the White House wouldn't fill in the blanks. But again, David, we do expect to hear from the president and the vice president at some point sooner than later. And the vice president, I will say, did an interview earlier today where she said that this verdict will not heal the pain that has existed for generations. And that is a point that we should make here, that my colleagues who have been reporting on this story for going on a year now, that this verdict doesn't end this conversation that needs to keep happening in this country about reform and policing and justice. And I'm certain that that is something the president will hit on today.
Cecilia Vega at the White House. We just learned from Cecilia moments ago that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will have comments on this verdict, public comments in the hours to come from Washington. We do know that the president talked with the family of George Floyd, a relationship that he struck up with them since not long after this tragedy, which takes us back into the months leading up to the election, of course. I want to bring in Nightline anchor Byron Pitts because as we were talking about with Cecilia there, Byron, it reminds me of part of the case that the prosecution made, that they said that this was, not an anti-police prosecution, that this was about former Officer Derek Chauvin. And in trying to make that point, they put up a visual inside the courtroom showing all of the faces of the police witnesses who testified against Derek Chauvin. That was extremely rare to see in a case of alleged police misconduct. We now know that the jury has found him guilty, but extremely rare to see the number of faces in no particular order, although the police chief himself saying that he did not act in accordance with police policy. Very strong words from the police department. And I gather, as Cecilia points out, this is also going to be a conversation that continues and one with political undertones to it, and the president will likely have to thread the needle, essentially, I gather, making a similar case to what we heard from the prosecution, that this isn't an anti-police moment in this country, but that this was about an officer accused of wrongdoing and now found guilty by a jury, a very diverse jury in Minneapolis.
That's right, David. A diverse American jury believed their eyes. And frankly, that's been rare in American history in major moments, that black and white America see the same event and have the same reaction to it. I have a few thoughts, Dave. I was thinking about what the prosecutor, Jerry Blackwell, said yesterday to your point about law enforcement. He said being a cop in America, it's about in your custody, in your care, not in your custody, I don't care. So I think this verdict certainly sends a message to law enforcement across this nation about what the public expects of them. I'm also mindful of what Dr. King said in March of 1968. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I would think for people who were satisfied by today's verdict that justice found its sweet spot. And David, lastly, I'm mindful of something, though, that one of the demonstrators, protesters, said. A woman gathered down there at George Floyd Square said, as we saw the images of people reacting, the woman said the healing work begins. And I think that's worth noting. For all the optimism that many people may feel in this moment, history has shown us for every success, there are setbacks. I think about, that pivotal moment in American history when Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech in 1963. 18 days later, though, there was a bombing at a Birmingham church and 4 girls died. So in many ways, this trial was hard, watching that videotape was hard, but the healing work that woman spoke of, history has shown that is equally hard, if not more difficult. So yes, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So perhaps we did find justice today, but there is so much work to be done in police stations, in courtrooms, in corporations across this nation, in homes across this nation. So significant night today, but so much work to come.
Byron Pitts of Nightline. Byron, always great to have you help guide the way here with us as we're on the air. You're watching ABC News live coverage of the verdict in the trial against former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Obviously, a short time ago, found guilty on all 3 counts, found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. As I've been explaining as we go, this trial has been different in many ways because it's playing out in the middle of a pandemic. The judge making the rare decision to live stream the trial, which allowed the country and really the world to watch. Of course, we did not see the jurors, and we do have what we call the pool report from the reporter who was allowed in that room, describing the jurors walking into that room rather stoically, no emotion on their face, extremely serious, describing the former police officer Chauvin studying them, studying the judge as he read the verdict, and then getting up very calmly as he was handcuffed and then escorted out of that courtroom. We heard in the moments right before that the state asking the judge to revoke bail, which we knew they would do if he was found guilty on any of these charges, and of course on all 3. And he was guided out of that courtroom. As we mentioned with Dan Abrams earlier in our coverage, he will be sentenced based on the most serious of those 3 charges. That's in accordance with Minnesota law. He faces potentially decades behind bars. And Dan Abrams suggested that perhaps as part of that sentencing, they will use what the prosecution used in their rebuttal. Basically going back to the 9-year-old girl. There were so many witnesses there that day, but going back to that 9-year-old girl who said she listened in 9 minutes, 29 seconds into that moment. The paramedics then arriving, Derek Chauvin still with his knee to George Floyd's neck, and that 9-year-old girl said she could hear paramedics having to tell Chauvin, get off of him. Byron Pitts making the point there that this was a diverse jury, that this was an all-American jury, if you will. 6 white jurors, 4 black jurors, and 2 people who described themselves as multiracial. Perhaps that will offer a unifying message as the country digests the verdict in this case and as we begin the conversation about what comes next. I wanted to bring in Terry Austin of the Law and Crime Network because, Terry, in addition to the jury, we heard the defense make that case in the last 24 hours, and they did this throughout the trial. They tried to characterize the bystanders there as potential, as potential threats to Derek Chauvin, certainly at the very least a distraction to Derek Chauvin. And then we heard that rebuttal from the prosecution, and I'm curious if you think that rebuttal had any impact, because obviously they have now decided the way they have. They've agreed with the prosecution, but there was that point that he made when he said those bystanders, those witnesses, a threat. And he basically said, come on, I mean, you saw them. And he pointed out to the jury that you met almost all of those bystanders who had come in as witnesses. And Terry, we all witnessed, as the nation watched this trial, very emotional testimony from each one of them about what they witnessed. And the faces of those witnesses represented all different backgrounds in this country.
There is no question that on rebuttal, when Jerry Blackwell mentioned the fact that that crowd was there with the jury, that crowd took the pictures, they witnessed what happened, and they told you as a jury that this was wrong, that this should not be happening. We have a 9-year-old girl who said, just get up off of him. I definitely think that was very impactful. And frankly, I believe that those witnesses who are hearing this verdict are happy. They understand that they did their part in this process. They came forward, they told the truth, they were listened to, and I think it's going to affect the entire judicial system, and it will have an incredible impact on the world. Here we are seeing finally that individuals are being held individually accountable for their actions, not just passing laws, and those are important, not just having police reform, and that is important, but actually having a police officer being held personally accountable for having used excessive force against an individual of color. I think finally we can sigh a breath of relief, and I think finally we are at a tipping point. And I'll add one last thing. I am here in Harlem. When the guilty verdict came out on all 3 counts, you could hear all of Harlem cheering, and that is only the second time that I've heard that. The first time was when we saw Joe Biden get voted for president. And so I think it is astronomical that this is happening, and I think the world is reacting.
Terry, stick with us here. I just have a note for our audience. For those of you watching, we know that many of our stations might pull away for their 6 o'clock local news. For the rest of the country, we will be staying on with our live coverage, ABC News live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, found guilty today on all charges. And for those of you who will be going to local news, I'll see you at 6:30 right afterward. In the meantime, Terry, I wanted to come back to you because I wanted your...
Delaware Valley's leading news program with
several main pillars in their argument, but the most significant pillar of all was, of course, the 9 minutes.
And so the jury has rendered its verdict in the death of George Floyd. Former police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder.